"You're not on the list. Ma'am, this spa requires certain standard. Maybe try something more accessible." The words, though cloaked in politeness, cut with surgical precision. They weren't shouted. No slurs. No name-calling. Just the soft erosion of dignity disguised as policy. Subtle but loud to anyone who's lived on the wrong side of assumption. And yet, the woman they were directed at didn't flinch. Not immediately. She had learned long ago that battles worth winning weren't fought in lobbies, but in boardrooms. Have you ever been judged based on your appearance before you even spoke a word? If you believe discrimination has no place in the world, hit that subscribe button and share this story, because corporate accountability starts with us refusing to stay silent. It was a Monday afternoon when Dr. Jenna Gomez entered the Meadow Spa, a luxury wellness sanctuary perched atop Manhattan's glistening skyline. The kind of place where lavender-scented towels cost more than most gym memberships, and where appointments were secured weeks in advance. Unless, of course, you knew someone. She didn't need to know someone. She was someone. But to the young receptionist with immaculate makeup and a barely concealed air of disdain, Jenna was just a woman in smart jeans, a silk blouse, and dark skin. Someone who, despite exuding quiet wealth in every detail, simply didn't belong. The spa's reception area was serene by design. Polished marble floors, towering fiddle-leaf fig trees, aromatherapy diffusing quietly into air that was already sweetened by money. Wealth whispered here, never shouted. And yet, when Jenna approached the front desk, silence fell hard. Other patrons, clad in designer athleisure and clutching branded water bottles, shifted subtly. Eyes tracked her movements, not in admiration but in that specific, wearying way. The way that asks without asking, "What's she doing here?" Jenna had seen it before. At galas, at conferences, in luxury boutiques. The look that traveled from her skin to her shoes to her ID with the speed of a threat assessment. She had long ago mastered the art of meeting that gaze without emotion. But there was something about this moment that pinched. Maybe it was the way the receptionist tilted her head, confusion masked as courtesy. Or maybe it was the too tight smile that followed once Jenna gave her name. "Oh," the woman had said, "we just don't have you in the system, and we're fully booked today, unfortunately." Jenna responded with clarity, providing the confirmation email on her phone. A platinum membership identifier gleamed beneath her name, unmistakable to anyone trained in the spa's elite loyalty program. Still, hesitation lingered on the receptionist's face. She tapped her keyboard, slowly, deliberately, each keystroke echoing in the now tense quiet. Another staff member appeared, this one in a blazer, possibly a manager, though she never introduced herself. She studied the phone screen, then Jenna, then murmured something to the receptionist. The words weren't audible, but the message was clear in the way they both looked at her. There was no mistake in the system, only in judgment. The spa's own brochure, sitting just inches from the desk, boasted inclusive excellence and diversity in wellness. Jenna stared at the words for a moment, wondering how many others had read that same line while being quietly excluded. She wasn't angry, not yet, but she was watching, calculating. 12 feet away, a woman in a white terry robe whispered to her friend. They both glanced in Jenna's direction before lowering their voices. This was not the first time something like this had happened, but it had been a while since it happened so overtly, so publicly, and in such a polished setting. What those watching didn't know was that the woman they were trying to handle quietly was not just a member, not just a client, not just someone with a black card and a powerful last name. Dr. Jenna Gomez was the majority shareholder in the parent company that owned the Meadow Spa Group. She had built her empire in silence. Not the flashy kind of success that demanded red carpets or TV profiles. Hers was the power of clean spreadsheets, decisive mergers, and acquired silence from underperforming CEOs. For the past 15 years, she had turned failing wellness brands into global success stories, always behind the scenes. Until now. And that's what made this moment different. Because in this lobby, at this moment, she wasn't being viewed as a CEO or a stakeholder. She was just being viewed and dismissed as the manager offered her a coupon for a free introductory facial at our sister location downtown. A location far less exclusive. Jenna simply nodded and placed her phone in her purse. She was being told, ever so politely, to leave. Not with words, but with the weight of passive bias and the institutional politeness that cloaked it. Other customers looked on, unsure whether to intervene. A man in a suit pretended to read his phone. A mother sipped her green smoothie a little faster. A young woman near the juice bar lifted her phone discreetly to record. None of them knew they were watching the first scene in what would become a public reckoning. Because in exactly 12 minutes, the same people who dismissed her would realize who she was. And by then, it wouldn't be about a missed massage or an insult. It would be about accountability. Public, permanent, and powerful. But for now, Jenna turned on her heel, walked back through the glass doors, and stepped into the Manhattan afternoon. Not angry, not loud, just resolved. Because when you own the building, you don't need to raise your voice. You just need to make one call. And Jenna Gomez was about to make that call. Outside the spa's revolving doors, the early autumn air clung to Jenna Gomez's skin in a way that felt oddly sobering. The city pulsed with its usual rhythm. Honking taxis, hurried conversations, the echo of heels against pavement. But Jenna's world had momentarily narrowed to that glass-walled lobby behind her. She wasn't shaken. She was still. Still in that dangerous, razor-sharp kind of silence only those who have tasted public humiliation learn to master. The kind that doesn't tremble or cry, it calculates. It remembers. It builds. 12 minutes was all she needed. Back inside the Meadow Spa, the air had shifted, but not for the better. The receptionist, Megan, according to her name tag, was now trying to recover from the discomfort that lingered after Jenna's departure. Her manager, Marla Hastings, had returned to her desk and was already adjusting her posture in front of a mirror, muttering something about client image control. No one said Jenna's name. No one asked where she had gone. To them, she had been handled. But the truth was, she had simply given them enough rope. The other patrons, however, hadn't missed the interaction. Something about Jenna's composure had left an impression. That kind of quiet dignity, the way she stood unflinching, even as she was subtly escorted out, left behind a tension that even scented candles and ambient cello music couldn't mask. It was the way she held her silence that made people start wondering who she really was. Meanwhile, Jenna didn't hail a car. She didn't call her assistant or vent to her lawyer. Instead, she walked down the block, turned the corner, and entered a cafe with a wide window view of the spa's entrance. She ordered a tea, sat by the window, and waited. In front of her, her phone rested on the table. Silent, screen dark. But her mind wasn't quiet. It was tracing the contours of what had just occurred. Not just the incident, but the pattern, the bigger picture. Because this wasn't just about one receptionist being dismissive, or a single manager making a bad call. It was about a culture that could allow such behavior to exist comfortably behind the luxury of professionalism. It was about the kind of environment that didn't just tolerate subtle discrimination, but rewarded it under the guise of maintaining standards. Jenna knew these patterns intimately. She had seen them before. In the meetings she wasn't invited to, in the partnerships she had to fight harder to close, in the way her invoices were double-checked when her white counterparts were not. What stung wasn't the rejection. Jenna had long stopped feeling pain from that. What stung was the gall of it. The audacity to assume she didn't belong, even in a building where her name had once been part of the architecture budget. This was the same spa she had once approved for partnership. Not because she needed the money, but because she believed in the idea. The mission. The lie they had sold her about inclusive luxury. Clearly, someone had forgotten who signed the checks. Back at the spa, a new customer arrived. A white woman in designer yoga wear. She greeted Megan by name, handed over her ID, and was immediately ushered to the back, past the velvet rope Jenna hadn't been allowed beyond. Marla offered her a lavender towel and a complimentary serum sample. Nothing about the woman's treatment required verification, deposits, or proof. The hypocrisy wasn't even subtle. It was systemic. Meanwhile, Jenna's phone screen lit up. First, an email, Meadow Operations, Weekly Report, Q3 Client Experience Metrics attached. Then, a message from her executive assistant. Did you get to your appointment okay? Also, FYI, next week's stakeholder review moved to Friday. The team needs your voice in the next expansion draft. Jenna didn't respond. Not yet. Instead, she scrolled through Meadow's public reviews. She knew what she was looking for, and within moments she found it. A 2-star review from a black woman dated only 3 weeks ago. She described a situation almost identical to Jenna's. Another described being told her attire didn't match the spa aesthetic. One review, politely written, questioned why she and her Latina friend were the only ones asked to leave their IDs at the front desk. It wasn't a one-off. It was a culture. And Jenna, in that moment, decided the culture needed cleansing. But not with fire. With reform, precision, documentation, authority. She opened her calendar app, checked the time. 12 minutes had passed. Exactly. She finished her tea, stood, and crossed the street with the kind of calm that people mistake for softness, until they meet the consequence. Inside the spa, Megan was preparing to rotate out for her lunch break. Marla was chatting in the staff room about her evening plans. Neither of them noticed Jenna's return. Not right away, but they noticed when 3 people in suits walked in behind her. They noticed when one of them pulled out a leather-bound folder, embossed with the Gomez Equity Group seal. They noticed when Jenna smiled, not out of joy, but out of finality. Because now, Jenna wasn't a customer. She was the correction. She was the audit. She was the person whose silence was more terrifying than any shouting guest they'd ever encountered. The receptionist's fake smile faltered. The manager stiffened. Staff emerged from the back, sensing a shift in energy that not even the calming playlist could mask. Clients peeked from saunas and lounges, sensing a disturbance they couldn't quite define. And Jenna? She simply looked at the same people who had turned her away 12 minutes ago, and finally let them know exactly who she was. And in the next act, that knowledge would become consequence. Because this time, it wasn't Jenna who didn't belong. It was them. The shift didn't begin with yelling. There was no dramatic scene, no shouting match, just a quiet realignment of power, like the soft ticking of a clock before the alarm sounds. When Dr. Jenna Gomez re-entered Meadow Spa, she was no longer alone. The 2 associates who flanked her wore tailored suits that matched hers in tone but not in authority. Their presence didn't need explaining. They weren't bodyguards. They weren't assistants. They were instruments of change summoned for a correction. Inside the spa, the curated calm was still intact. Soft piano hummed through hidden speakers. Reed diffusers cast warm, floral notes into the air. But something colder settled in. An unease subtle at first, like the moment a perfectly clear window suddenly reveals its cracks in the right light. It started when the front desk staff looked up and recognized her. Not as a client, not as someone they'd helped, but as the woman they had quietly turned away minutes earlier. The one who had left without a scene. The one they assumed they would never see again. Now she was back, and this time their eyes caught details they missed before. The seal embossed on the folder one of her associates held. The quiet deference in the way they stepped slightly behind her without being asked. The absence of irritation on her face. She wasn't returning with emotion. She was returning with purpose. The receptionist, Megan, faltered. Her hand hovered above her keyboard like it wasn't sure what it was supposed to do now. She was trained to project elegance, not to respond to a reversal in hierarchy. From the spa's open lounge area, patrons watched. Some leaned forward in their plush robes and slippers. A few recognized her now. Not from the spa but from Otherworld's magazine covers, keynote panels, nonprofit galas. Her face had appeared next to headlines that praised innovation, philanthropy, power. But it wasn't her face that gave her away now. It was the silence around her. The kind of silence that carried gravity. Near the juice bar, a man paused mid-sip, frozen by curiosity. A group of women seated near the eucalyptus steam room tilted their heads toward the commotion. The energy had changed and people noticed. They didn't know yet what they were watching, but they knew it mattered. The receptionist's voice cracked slightly as she stood, but Jenna didn't acknowledge her. She wasn't here for excuses. Not now. The time for redirection had passed. Her associate placed a document binder gently on the counter. The front page bore the Meadow logo in faded watermark, and beneath it, immediate compliance review, equity, conduct, and culture audit. The receptionist's lips parted, but no sound came. Across the spa, word spread with the speed of intuition. Employees whispered behind glass walls and locker doors. Clients exchanged glances, each wondering what part of the curtain was being pulled back. The quiet dignity of Jenna's reappearance created friction against the boutique luxury environment. A place curated to feel untouchable now felt exposed. It wasn't rage or revenge that was setting in, it was accountability. And accountability rarely came wearing sneakers and fury. Sometimes it arrived in 4-inch heels, a pressed blazer, and the full weight of institutional authority. One by one, staff started to notice that more people had paused what they were doing. Clients who had ignored the earlier scene were now watching this one. Phones that had pretended to be checking messages were now recording discreetly. Not with hostility, but with a strange kind of collective awareness. They were witnessing something rare. Justice unfolding in real time, wrapped not in outrage but in order. The assistant spa director, a man named Richard, emerged from the hallway leading to the private treatment suites. He carried himself with the usual brand of self-importance that came with managing high-end hospitality. Until now, he had stayed above the fray. He hadn't been involved in Jenna's initial rejection, but he had seen her from a distance, overheard enough to know she had been denied service. He'd chosen not to intervene. Now, as he watched her engage quietly with his staff, her voice measured, her tone professional, he felt his palms dampen. He hadn't thought she was anyone important, and that was the mistake. He stepped forward, offering to clarify things, hoping to neutralize whatever storm was brewing. But the glance Jenna gave him halted him mid-step. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't cold. It was just final. She didn't need his mediation. She had already rendered judgment. What the staff had failed to realize earlier was now evident to everyone watching. The woman they turned away was not just a client. She was the force they would now answer to. Clients whispered among themselves. Is that the investor they mentioned in last quarter's earnings email? She looks like someone who's been on CNBC. Did you see how that manager backed down? Whispers soon turned into commentary. A woman live-streaming on Instagram tilted her phone subtly, capturing Jenna as she flipped through a packet of compliance records without saying a word. Her caption read, "This spa is about to have a very bad day." In the sauna corridor, 2 young women who had watched Jenna be dismissed earlier spoke quietly. One of them admitted she had almost said something at the time but didn't want to make a scene. Now she wished she had. One spa employee, a newer hire named Jade, stood frozen behind the guest check-in screen. She had recognized Jenna the moment she walked in the first time, had even followed her on LinkedIn for years. But when she saw her being denied, she stayed silent. Not out of malice, but because the culture had trained her to obey authority, even when it was clearly wrong. Now Jade watched her coworkers scramble, not out of empathy but out of fear, and she felt something new settle in her chest. Not just shame, but resolve. Across the spa, people stopped pretending to be guests. They became witnesses. The energy had shifted completely. This was no longer a luxury sanctuary. It was a case study, an unraveling, a moment being etched in digital ink through 100 smartphones and whispered retellings. And Jenna? She didn't raise her voice. She didn't threaten. She simply handed a sealed envelope to Richard. The envelope bore one line: termination protocol. Branch non-compliance. No further explanation. No second chances. She turned, nodded to her associates, and began walking toward the private elevator that led to the executive level. And as she did, no one in the spa, not clients, not staff, asked her to wait. They didn't dare, because the story was no longer about what had happened to Jenna Gomez. It was about what was about to happen to everyone else. By the time Dr. Jenna Gomez stepped into the elevator that led to the spa's executive floor, The building had already begun to ripple beneath her. Not physically, but structurally, within its culture, its hierarchy, and its carefully curated facade of excellence. She stood in the center of the polished steel capsule as it hummed upward. Her reflection, clean and strong, stared back from mirrored panels. There was no anger in her face, only clarity. Beneath her, the boutique that had dismissed her just minutes ago was beginning to feel a pressure it hadn't anticipated. One they were entirely unprepared for. When the elevator doors opened onto the 47th floor, she stepped into silence. But it wasn't the spa's version of silence. It wasn't scented or commercial. This was the silence of governance, of real power. A long corridor stretched ahead, floor-to-ceiling windows casting Manhattan's skyline across marble floors. It was the kind of hallway most employees never entered unless they were being promoted or reprimanded. At the far end sat Boardroom 1A, its tall oak doors closed for privacy. Inside, the quarterly stakeholder review meeting had already begun. But it was about to take a very different turn. The executive assistant standing outside the doors, new, nervous, stood when Jenna approached. She didn't ask for ID. She didn't need to. Her eyes widened as recognition dawned. It wasn't every day the majority shareholder attended a mid-quarter review in person. Jenna didn't speak. She nodded once. That was enough. The assistant pushed open the doors. Inside the boardroom, 12 department heads and regional directors sat around a table that gleamed like glass, blinking against the sudden light spilling in behind Jenna. They had been deep into a presentation on expansion metrics. Graphs and charts hovered on a digital display. Discussions were focused on revenue growth, partnership leads, and customer acquisition rates. They hadn't seen the emails. Not yet. They hadn't seen the social media clips. They hadn't read the compliance report Jenna had authored and delivered herself. But they were about to. As Jenna entered the room, several members stood reflexively. The board chair, an older man with silver-rimmed glasses and a reputation for pragmatism, greeted her with mild confusion. She was early technically, or at least unannounced, and Jenna Gomez didn't make appearances without intention. She took her seat at the head of the table without waiting for invitation. Her presence alone shifted the oxygen in the room. Conversations fell away. The rhythm of the meeting disintegrated. She opened the leather portfolio in front of her, unfolded a single document, and slid it forward into the center of the table. It wasn't a spreadsheet. It wasn't a market analysis. It was the official draft of a compliance violation summary. Signed, time-stamped, and linked to a subsidiary brand listed clearly. Meadow Spa, Fifth Avenue flagship. Heads tilted. The board members didn't understand yet, but Jenna was about to show them. She tapped her tablet once. The room's projection screen responded instantly, pulling up the live monitoring dashboard from the brand's digital feedback system. It displayed analytics in real-time, social media mentions, review velocity, client sentiment. In the last 2 hours, Meadow had seen a 1,100% increase in public mentions. Negative sentiment, 89% and climbing. Keywords like racism, humiliation, and discrimination blazed across the dashboard like warning lights on a cockpit panel. It had already gone viral. As the board absorbed the visuals, Jenna began her assessment. She didn't raise her voice. Her words weren't performative. They were surgical, clinical. She laid out the sequence of events, beginning with her personal visit, the behavior of the staff, and the spa's failure to execute even its most basic protocols of professionalism. But she didn't dwell on her own experience. Instead, she shifted the lens outward. She showed them a customer sentiment report over the past 12 months. Reviews from women of color who had been turned away, subtly excluded, or discouraged from booking high-tier treatments. She displayed complaint logs that had been closed without resolution. She highlighted the spa's dismal diversity statistics across leadership positions: 0 black executives, 0 non-white managers, and fewer than 5% staff of color in visible client-facing roles. It was a pattern, not an event. A system, not a mistake. The spa hadn't just rejected Jenna Gomez. It had rejected every woman who had dared to walk in with confidence and walk out in disappointment. And now the reckoning had arrived. Jenna then displayed a chart showing lost revenue projections if the spa continued on this trajectory. She didn't have to inflate the numbers. Public backlash was already causing appointment cancellations, membership downgrades, and withdrawal of private sponsors. The projected damage over the next fiscal quarter, $2.8 million. Then came the legal exposure. Federal anti-discrimination statutes, civil rights violations, potential class action from marginalized clients. Jenna had seen it all before, and she had no intention of letting it happen under her watch again. Across the room, the mood shifted from discomfort to alarm. The board chair, usually composed, was now visibly unnerved. He glanced around the table, seeking someone who might offer a rebuttal. No one spoke. Finally, Jenna reached for the final document in her folder. A motion to immediately terminate the entire branch leadership team at Meadow Flagship. Not out of vengeance, but because accountability demanded visible consequence. There would be replacements. The company's diversity and inclusion consultants had already provided recommendations. Interim management would be appointed within 72 hours. A new bias-free client service protocol would be implemented company-wide. It included anonymous reporting, quarterly audits, mandatory bias training, and a new executive director of culture, someone with decision-making power and direct access to Jenna herself. She closed her folder. Not a word wasted. Not a moment out of control. No one argued. They couldn't. She wasn't just a name on the shareholder ledger. She was the one who had kept this company profitable for a decade. The one who had taken struggling wellness brands and turned them into empires. And now, she was the one restoring integrity to a business that had forgotten who it was supposed to serve. Outside the boardroom, employees were being notified. A corporate memo was drafted and sent across the entire company within the hour. It acknowledged the incident, named it, owned it, and outlined every measure Jenna had proposed. It wasn't damage control. It was culture correction. In less than 12 minutes, Jenna had gone from being denied service in a lobby to rewriting the future of the brand that had humiliated her. Not through outrage, but through action. Outside the walls of the boardroom, the world was beginning to pay attention. Not to the quarterly reports, not to the spa's promotional offers or its curated list of exclusive clientele, but to a moment. A 12-minute moment that had begun with quiet disrespect and was now rippling into a lesson few would forget. What had begun with murmurs inside Meadow had grown into a wave on social media. A customer seated near the steam room had posted a short video of the initial incident. A black woman being discreetly redirected toward a less exclusive location. The video didn't capture Jenna's name, but it captured her grace, her stillness, the condescension in the manager's tone. The way the receptionist's fingers danced across the keyboard, not to help, but to delay. In less than an hour, the video had surpassed 27,000 views. By the time Jenna had finished presenting to the board, major platforms were beginning to share the clip. Influencer accounts reposted it with captions like, "When you mistake power for poverty." News outlets were reaching out to confirm the identity of the woman in the video. No one in the public knew yet who she was. But that would soon change. Jenna, seated at the head of the boardroom table, was still calm. She had never needed a camera to do her work. Her influence didn't live in social feeds, it lived in systems. And yet, she understood the optics of the moment. The weight of silence. The value of timing. She didn't need to rush. The reckoning would arrive precisely on time. Her phone buzzed. 3 short vibrations from her legal chief's direct line. A silent notification. The article had gone live. A major business magazine had just published the headline. CEO denied entry to her own spa. 12 minutes later, she fires the entire management team. Beneath it, a high-resolution photo of Jenna, taken at a recent Forbes panel, anchored the story. The subheading read, "Dr. Jenna Gomez, majority shareholder of the Meadow Wellness Empire, responds to bias not with outrage, but with irreversible action." The boardroom hadn't seen it yet. Not all of them, anyway. But they would. They always did. Screens buzzed. Phones lit up. Eyes flickered down to laps and discrete devices as the notification reached inboxes. It was the kind of headline that executives dread. Not because of the press, but because of what it meant. The story had left their control. The public now knew the truth. That the woman they watched being dismissed was the woman who had built the very foundation these directors stood upon. And while Jenna didn't need validation, the ripple mattered. Because this wasn't just about her. It was about every woman who had walked into a boardroom and been assumed to be an assistant. Every client who had been followed in a store. Every black professional who had been told, through smiles and policies, that they needed to earn belonging. Now, those policies were being rewritten, and Jenna was holding the pen. As the board sat in stunned silence, one executive finally broke. The head of brand partnerships, one of the newer appointees, apologized. He used the word unacceptable more than once. But Jenna didn't respond. She didn't need apologies. She needed change, and she was already delivering it. The next wave arrived not from inside the building, but from the street. Protest was not Jenna's preferred method, but she respected its power. Outside the spa, a small crowd had gathered. Some were activists. Some were customers. Some were just New Yorkers who had seen the story and recognized its truth. A few carried handmade signs. One read, "Exclusivity should never mean exclusion." Another, "Wellness isn't white." News vans began parking along the curb. Clients inside the spa grew uneasy, unsure whether to check out early or stay, and pretend the world wasn't shifting around them. One woman in a robe tried to exit quietly through a side door, only to find herself face-to-face with a camera. She covered her face with her towel. But the real story was still inside. While the board scrambled to issue internal memos and draft damage control, Jenna was already several moves ahead. Her communications team had activated a 3-tier response. 1. A press release outlining the company's immediate actions, including termination of the branch leadership and appointment of interim management. 2. A formal apology not from Jenna, but from the chair of the board, acknowledging systemic failure, not just a mistake. 3. A partnership announcement with a civil rights advisory firm to audit all spa locations for bias in service, hiring, and marketing. The story had shifted from scandal to solution, from silence to strategy, and still Jenna remained composed. That was the thing about her. She never entered a room with noise, but she never left it unchanged. Within the next 30 minutes, headlines multiplied. CEO exposes bias at her own luxury spa. Power, poise, and policy. How Jenna Gomez reclaimed her space. The 12-minute turnaround that sparked an industry reckoning. Other wellness brands began releasing statements of solidarity, some sincere, others performative. A few, worried they might be next, began internally auditing their own customer service policies. Jenna had done more than correct a personal injustice. She had set a precedent that sometimes change doesn't come with shouting. It comes with silence so commanding, it makes the system listen. One of Jenna's associates returned to the boardroom and handed her a tablet. A live dashboard showed real-time responses from Meadows' other branches. Locations were requesting training. Executives were issuing statements. Clients were flooding the inbox with support and questions. Jenna nodded once. The associate stepped away. Outside, the protest had grown. But so had the movement. What had begun as one woman being turned away was now hundreds, maybe thousands, watching that moment unravel into something powerful. At the heart of it all, Jenna remained exactly as she had started. Calm, precise, unapologetic. She hadn't fought to enter that spa. She had waited for the right moment to remind them. She already owned it. And now, she was taking it back. By nightfall, the spa that once stood for sanctuary now stood as a symbol. Meadow, marketed as a haven of calm, exclusivity, and sophistication, was no longer defined by the scent of eucalyptus and curated luxury playlists, but by a failure of principle that echoed louder than any soothing flute melody. Inside its walls, calm had turned to chaos. The fallout was not dramatic in volume, but in velocity. The management team that had handled Jenna Gomez so poorly only hours earlier was now scrambling to find ground beneath their feet. The official termination notices arrived electronically first, clinical, time-stamped, and unambiguous. Effective immediately, the flagship's branch director, guest services manager, and floor supervisor were relieved of duty. No performance review, no HR back and forth, no final warnings. The decision had already been reviewed, approved, and signed off by legal. There would be no appeals. It wasn't just about what happened in those 12 minutes. It was about the culture that allowed it to happen without question. The kind of slow, silent rot that grows in institutions built to look flawless on the outside while quietly tolerating inequity on the inside. Jenna hadn't just exposed the wound. She'd scalpeled it open and lit the room. Back at Meadow, staff gathered in hushed clumps in locker rooms and behind counters. Conversations had shifted from confusion to resignation. Everyone had seen the headlines. The viral footage had made its way into group chats, employee forums, and even the internal Slack channels where no one dared type much anymore. Nobody defended what had happened. Not because they were all enlightened, but because now the cost of ignorance was measurable. Leadership was gone. Reputations were shattered. The cushioned layer of protection around the spa's image had been peeled away, and behind it were systems that had always been broken, now made visible. And in the world of luxury hospitality, visibility was everything. The regional director arrived late into the evening to deliver in-person statements. Not for drama, but because it mattered to show presence. Corporate protocol had shifted into crisis mode. Every executive who had ever used the phrase client experience was now face-to-face with the consequences of what happens when customer service is built on biased assumptions. Jenna had stayed silent since the reveal. Not a single social media post from her. No press statement. No retaliation. She didn't need to say anything. The truth was doing just fine on its own. Still, she remained engaged, tracking every department's response, reading every incoming email, meeting every hour with legal, compliance, and brand rehabilitation teams. She didn't crave punishment for the people involved. She had no use for humiliation. What she wanted, what she demanded, was systemic correction. Across the organization, the ripple moved faster than anyone anticipated. At least 7 regional spas under the Meadow brand voluntarily initiated internal reviews before corporate instructed them to. Some even hired third-party consultants overnight. They understood the gravity of the moment. If Jenna had been targeted at the flagship, the message was clear. No branch, no team, no leader was immune from scrutiny. Customers, too, were making their voices heard. Hundreds of emails flooded the customer care inbox. Some from longtime members threatening to cancel if change wasn't immediate. Others from new clients, commending Jenna's leadership and asking how the brand planned to honor its updated commitments. But perhaps the most surprising messages came from within. Anonymous messages from employees who had been too afraid to speak up for years. Front desk assistants, massage therapists, cleaning staff, many of whom were women of color, sharing their quiet moments of being overlooked, questioned, or talked down to, not by customers, but by their own teams. Jenna read each one, every story, every voice, every lived experience that mirrored her own. She saw in them the quiet exhaustion of existing in a system that masked exclusion with elegance. And so, the reforms came swiftly, not as gestures but as blueprints. The company rolled out its bias interruption program, a multi-phase plan Jenna had been developing behind the scenes for months before this incident gave it rocket fuel. Every Meadow employee, regardless of role or seniority, would undergo certified bias recognition and de-escalation training. Not one-hour PowerPoints, not signature-only acknowledgements, but immersive workshops, scenario-based simulations, and progress assessments that affected real promotion eligibility. A new anonymous reporting system was launched, allowing staff and clients alike to flag discriminatory behavior in real time. The system routed reports to an independent ethics panel, no longer internal HR. Each location was now required to conduct quarterly culture audits, where both clients and staff completed blind feedback forms about the equity and inclusivity of their experience. Those results would be made public. Transparency wasn't a PR tactic anymore, it was policy. And Jenna had appointed an entirely new executive role, Chief Inclusion and Culture Officer, someone with veto power over every staffing decision, brand partnership, and customer-facing campaign across all spa locations. All these changes happened not over months, but in days. Because Jenna wasn't building a response. She was building a legacy. For every woman like her who had walked into beautiful places only to be made to feel invisible. But amid all the movement, press interviews, legal reviews, staff reshuffling, Jenna remained centered. She didn't gloat. She didn't soften. She stayed on mission. Because for her, this wasn't personal vengeance. It was institutional stewardship. Late that evening, as the skyline dimmed and the spa finally closed its doors for the night, Jenna stood in her home office. The window behind her framed the city lights in quiet reflection. Her phone buzzed one final time. A short message from her assistant. All terminations completed. Staff notified. Bias protocol rollout approved by full board. Client statements scheduled to publish at sunrise. She allowed herself a single deep breath. Not satisfaction, just closure. She had been made to feel small in a building she partially owned. Now, she had used that same building to dismantle a hierarchy of exclusion and rebuild it from foundation to rooftop. This wasn't a victory born from noise. It was forged in clarity, vision, and non-negotiable principle. And tomorrow, when the spa opened its doors again, under new management, new policies, and a very different energy, it would no longer be a sanctuary for the exclusive. It would be a place where every client, regardless of skin tone or surname, was treated with equal dignity. Because Jenna Gomez had turned 12 minutes of disrespect into a lifetime of reform. It didn't happen with a ribbon cutting or a press conference. There were no champagne flutes or choreographed applause. The reopening of Meadows' flagship location came quietly, just 39 days after that pivotal 12-minute moment had sent shockwaves through the industry. But though the entryway was the same, and the logo still glowed softly against textured glass, everything underneath had changed. And it wasn't just cosmetic. What had begun as a humiliating encounter, an elegant black woman turned away from a luxury space she partially owned, had become a blueprint for equity in the wellness industry. The spa that once embodied exclusionary opulence now stood as a living, breathing case study in transformation. A symbol of what can happen when someone at the top refuses to stay silent, and instead uses their power to rebuild the very system that failed them. The change wasn't loud, but it was lasting. Inside, the scent was still lavender and bergamot. The playlist still featured cello and soft jazz. But new layers lived beneath the surface. Every employee now wore a small badge beneath their name tag, an emblem that read, simply, every guest, every time. It wasn't just a slogan. It was a pledge, contract, a new standard. The guest services team had been completely overhauled. Not just the faces, but the framework. Instead of hiring for polish and presentation, HR was now trained to identify cultural fluency, empathy, and trauma-informed client service. Candidates no longer needed referrals from existing clientele to apply. The gatekeeping had been dismantled, brick by brick. All new hires underwent mandatory 40-hour onboarding focused solely on bias recognition, emotional intelligence, and inclusive communication. These weren't modules clicked through on a lunch break. These were immersive sessions led by facilitators with lived experience, consultants from marginalized communities, DEI leaders, and even former clients who had once felt unwelcome in spaces just like this. Returning clients noticed it immediately. The shift was quiet but real. And it wasn't just the treatment rooms. Every product on the retail shelves had been reevaluated. Gone were the tone-deaf labels, the ethnically inspired oils with no accountability, the branding that catered only to whiteness. In their place were small batch, inclusive brands each handpicked by a new procurement team led by Jenna's appointed Director of Culture and Inclusion. But perhaps the most powerful transformation wasn't visible at all. It was structural. Every Meadow location now operated under the Gomez Equity Framework, a governance model developed in direct response to Jenna's experience. This framework required quarterly bias audits, public-facing transparency reports, and a mandatory 360-degree feedback loop between staff, clients, and leadership. Each location also had its own bias incident response officer, a full-time role embedded into the leadership team with direct access to the board. Any report of discrimination, no matter how subtle, triggered a 3-step review protocol. Outcomes ranged from retraining to reassignment, and in some cases, termination. But the focus was never on punishment, it was on prevention. And Jenna had gone even further. She launched the Serenity Equity Grant, a $5 million fund dedicated to helping other spa and wellness brands audit and rebuild their own systems. The grant didn't require applicants to have diversity plans in place. In fact, it prioritized those who didn't, those brave enough to admit they had failed and ready to change. Within the first 6 months, over 80 businesses applied. But Jenna didn't stop at spas. She partnered with hospitality schools, certifying them under her new bias-free guest experience training, which soon became industry standard. Hotels, resorts, even luxury gyms began to adopt the same training used at Meadow. Within a year, the program was recognized by 2 national certification bodies. Jenna's response had become a movement. She never once said, "I forgive you." That wasn't the point. This wasn't about forgiveness. It was about accountability that lasted beyond the headlines. About systems built not to protect reputations but to preserve dignity. And those who once dismissed her learned that dignity, when denied, doesn't disappear. It reorganizes, it reforms, and eventually it reshapes the very industry that tried to exclude it. The woman who had once been asked if she had an appointment now had her own portrait in the executive hallway of the parent company. Not a vanity photo, but a commemorative plaque acknowledging her leadership in transforming the Meadow brand into one of the most equitable wellness franchises in North America. Even the spa's shareholders felt the impact. Revenue had climbed by 12% in the first quarter following the incident. Not in spite of the reforms, but because of them. Clients who once felt invisible now felt invested. Loyalty came not just from the wealthy, but from those who had been waiting for spaces that didn't ask them to apologize for their existence. And Jenna? She never once gave a public interview about that day. She never said the names of the people who mistreated her. She never needed to. The spa itself had become her statement. She had been dismissed in 12 minutes and rebuilt the future in 12 months. And as new clients continued to walk through the same glass doors, unaware of the history baked into the marble, a new generation of staff greeted them. Not with assumptions, but with intention. Because Jenna Gomez didn't seek revenge. She chose reconstruction. And the industry would never be the same. Have you ever walked into a place and felt like you didn't belong before saying a single word? Have you been judged by your skin, your name, your silence? Then you know exactly why stories like this matter. If the story moved you, hit that subscribe button to support these voices. Leave a comment and tell us your experience, because silence protects systems, but stories spark change. Together, we document injustice. Together, we demand better. Together, we rebuild.